Hello, and welcome to the UnWokable podcast. I'm your host, Mark Owsley, and today I have the honor of joining us today on the podcast, Paul Rossi. He is the Senior Education Analyst for Legal Insurrection and is also on the advisory board of the Educational Liberty Alliance. And he came to great acclaim, well, not acclaim, but known to the public for speaking out against critical race theory at Grace Church in New York. Thanks, Paul, for being here.
Thanks, Mark. It's great to be here.
Well, I wanted to bring you on the podcast today. I've followed you ever since you came out with your infamous letter to your school that made all the headlines back when very few people were standing up to this, especially in public, when teachers were being cowed in all institutions, public and private alike. And first of all, I just want to commend you on your courage for doing that.
Thank you.
It was an inspiration to all of us in the education field, and gave us kind of a path that we could walk in order to start fighting back against this machine of wokeness that's happened to us. But I wanted to bring you on to first of all talk about what that fight was like, how it came about for you, what was going on in Grace Church School. What is Grace Church School? Because my audience is largely in Oklahoma and in the Midwest, and many may not have heard of you, and which is a shame because they all need to hear of you and what you've done, and so they can draw some strength from your courage. So, Paul, what brought you into this fight? What were you doing before, and how did you get into it?
Well, I started teaching about switching to a teaching career about 12 years ago, and I taught in some public schools, some SAT prep for a while. I did a lot of tutoring. And then I got a job in 2012 with a new high school, a private high school called Grace Church School in Manhattan. It's a 100-year-old institution. It's connected to a church, one of the most beautiful churches in the city. A Gothic revival church designed by the same architect that did St. Patrick's. So it has this rich tradition, but they were starting this new school with the intention to make it a very progressive school. Grace had already been, going in the progressive direction, but now they were going to satisfy what, from a business perspective, they saw as a need of the colleges, the top tier elite colleges that were looking for students, looking to admit students that were sort of pre-wokeified or woke-weaned, as I call it, on these ideas. So it was from the beginning, the school was designed to meet a market need. And I was thrilled to get work there. I was a left liberal myself. I thought of myself as a progressive, and I really found a home there. I loved it very much at the beginning. I was used to a corporate world in my 30s and 40s, or 30s and early 40s. So when I changed careers, it was a completely different, very nurturing environment. But gradually, as the years passed, I was teaching math. And I loved the independence. I loved that I could, the connection that I could make with the students to help them learn. But over time, I saw this ideology really take hold in a series of both extracurricular events, as well as in the courses, the classes themselves. Humanities started in the humanities and then spread as we were hiring younger teachers too. And I started to see the sense of sort of messianic duty that these teachers had towards social change, creating change agents, as they say. And certainly after Trump was elected, it went into high gear. And I went from being a progressive to sort of seeing the effect on the students of the ideology and how it manifested in their social relations with each other and their anxieties around being able to speak and articulate dissent in class. That to me was that chilling effect was the most disturbing thing that I saw. And I recognize this just as a math teacher. Of course, in private school, all the teachers wear different hats. So I was
Right.
involved also in being instrumental in kind of this indoctrination into anti-racism. We became an explicitly anti-racist school, it's called, in 2015. And it just kind of accelerated from there. But I went from grumbling in my beard, having a few a few run-ins with the administration, being sort of called in the, called to task a few times, and to sort of feeling that this was something that I had a duty to do something about, and I started to look for the right opportunity to say something publicly in the school. About 6 months before, I attended a racially segregated Zoom meeting where the facilitator was delivering a lecture as if it was fact around white supremacy and the characteristics of white supremacy. It's a very it's ubiquitous now because
Hmm.
it's permeated, this quote unquote scholarship has permeated all of higher education and K through 12, where things like objectivity and individualism and even a right to comfort are racialized
Hmm.
properties of white culture. And I just started to see every one of the kids with head bowed saying, yes, we're going to do better. Yes, white people invented racism and invented slavery, and all these things that are just, and Marxist in orientation, because
Yes.
they've been told by their teachers that capitalism itself is connected to white supremacy, and everything is this unified theory of oppression, essentially, where anything
Hmm.
falls into that bucket. And I saw the facilitator put up the slide with white supremacy characteristics. There are 15 of them. And, I said, what? And she said, as you look at these characteristics, you may find yourself experiencing, as white people, you may find yourself experiencing white feelings.
I didn't
Uh,
know feelings could be white.
right. So even the reaction, it's such a solipsistic bubble that even the
Hmm.
reaction to these preposterous assertions are themselves implicative of whiteness. So
Hmm.
you're in this trap of however you react to it, which is not, head bowed assent to this
Right.
belief system, is whiteness. So I,
Yeah.
I said, I had to say something, because I just was like, these children have never seen an authority figure, never seen a teacher publicly question what is going on here. So I just, that was kind of my breaking point, and I realized I was going to do this publicly in front of 200 people and 30, 40 of my colleagues. So I said, well, here we go. So I said,
Yeah.
I tried to keep it respectful. I tried to, I said, why are these characteristics being framed as racialized, when these are things that any people of any race or racialized in a particular way could manifest? There's, if you want to talk about, we could talk about, these things manifesting in China or manifesting in Africa
Hmm.
or any of the other multi-ethnic places in the world. Why is this, and that kind of opened the floodgates, and some kids, I was happy to see that I was successful. And
Hmm.
some kids questioned me back. They're like, you don't understand, Mr. Rossi, because you have privilege. And I was like, okay.
Right.
But then some kids were like, what, I think that this is, I feel this way too a lot of the time. And some of the
Hmm.
teachers even were saying, I don't think I don't think my whiteness determines my behavior or socially determines my behavior. So this kind of erupted, and the dam broke. And even the woman who arranged the meeting admits in the meeting that my questioning was actually really constructive, and so, like, but it did build to a point where one of the people in the meeting um, was really disturbed by the objections that I had raised, and was watching this sort of mental prison break,
Hmm.
and said, you don't understand. I'm shocked that there is a fellow teacher, a colleague among us, who doesn't understand that they are white and we are all white, and therefore we have privilege, and we are born into whiteness. And he's just kind of got on the high horse, and I interrupted him, and I just wasn't going to take it where he's just dunking on me in front of kids. And I just said, well, I'm sorry that you're stereotyping yourself.
Oh.
And
Yeah.
he just, this was flummoxed, and he came after me personally in front of a lot of kids. And this is,
Hmm.
this is not, this is an unprofessional moment, as it was
Hmm.
later conveyed to me. So
But it was
yeah,
unprofessional on your part, not on his
right,
part. I
exactly. So,
assume.
we
Yes.
both, and we have these things called norms.
Yeah.
Which are, one of the norms is don't interrupt your colleagues, but another norm is, don't generalize.
Yeah.
So my working within this quasi legalistic framework, my response is, well, yes, I violated a norm by interrupting a colleague. However, everyone was trampling on norms and generalizing about white people the whole time. So how, what are you gonna,
Right.
tit for
Yeah.
tat, I guess. We're both
Turnabout's
bad.
fair play here.
Right,
Right.
exactly.
Yeah.
So, but that didn't really help. The problem was that there was a simultaneous BIPOC meeting for students and faculty that were racialized as Black or Indigenous people of color.
So this
And
whole process was segregated.
right, the whole process. So, but
Mhm.
that meeting ended before ours did because we delved into all this stuff. And then, so some of the students and faculty in that meeting were shoulder surfing on their friends who, because this all took place over Zoom. So they were like, "What's going on here, Mr. Rossi? Why is he questioning the whole premise of our anti-racist quote unquote goals?"
Mm-hmm.
I actually have the same goals. I just don't share the premises, which is a different thing.
Right.
But essentially, I got into trouble because they had segregated the meetings. Everyone assumed the worst. People were scurrying around like, what happened in the white meeting? And so the it
I'm
was
sorry.
like
That just
it was like,
is
no,
ridiculous.
it is
Yeah.
ridiculous because there are, I counted them, there's 14 different committees devoted to diversity, equity, and inclusion, racial justice, anti-racism, so on, at the student, faculty, administration, board level, all these different levels.
Mm-hmm.
They have 14 different committees, and every one of these committees were scurrying around trying to explain what I did, even when they weren't in the meeting, because not everybody
Yeah.
was in the meeting. And
Mm-hmm.
the people who weren't in the meeting were saying, "Oh, what did he say?" And in this atmosphere of the hermeneutics of suspicion, of course, like
Mm-hmm.
I'm the racially fragile white math teacher, who.
Right.
So
Well.
and I was being used as post this meeting. I was used as an object lesson in some of the other
Mm-hmm.
teachers' classrooms. So they'd say,
They were
"Well,
waiting for you. They were waiting for you.
exactly." And so
Yeah.
but through it all, I was glad I did what I did because I
Yeah.
knew that I knew that it had done. I had maybe not done it as artfully as I wanted, but the moment was chosen. The moment had an impact, and I kept being told, you've harmed the people of color in this community. By your objections, you have harmed them. You have harmed their
Mm-hmm.
ancestors. You have harmed their families. You have made them feel unsafe. And I was even accused of harassment, that I had
Yeah.
harassed the children by asking a question. But when it came down to it, the most disruptive question I asked, which I just put in the chat, actually in the Zoom chat, was, to what extent must we accept an identity that society has placed upon us? That is, like, do
Mm-hmm.
we need to identify as society sees us? And that's the whole premise of all of
Right.
this, like
All
critical
of
race
this.
theory, right? Like, you're socially
Yes.
determined because people see you as white, and therefore you have privilege, and you're socially
Right.
oppressed because you're determined to be oppressed because people are oppressed.
Well,
So, at what point do you say, if everybody thinks I should jump off a bridge, should I jump
should
off a
I
bridge?
jump off a bridge? That's exactly
Right.
right.
Instead,
I want
which is,
I want to
yeah.
hit something in that real quick though, because you
Mhm.
said that there were 15 committees, right, that are all
Yeah.
devoted to some subset of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Which, just to point out to my audience, which I say this all the time, DEI is the enforcement of it's the enforcement arm of CRT, and there are
That's a good way to
many.
put it.
There are many. I call them divisions of ideological enforcement. That's their whole job. Is
That's
that
good. Yeah, that's true.
their desire is to or their whole mandate is to implant this ideology within an institution, both socially and policy. Because if you read How to Be an Anti-Racist, right, Kendi defines anti-racism explicitly in terms of public policy or institutional policy, and it's all designed to transform an institution towards a certain political goal, right? But I want to hit that fact that by the time you spoke up, there were already 15 committees or so of people who were waiting for you or some version of you, um, to combat, and they do that through their what they call their spheres of influence. And this is all from the social ecological model. You'll see everywhere. Actually, you're starting to see it in Kendi uses it in his book and with graphics on how to be an anti-racist. It's being used in health aspects, but it's basically you start with the person, and the next sphere of influence that you get is those directly that you have direct control over, which in a school setting, while kids are in school, are your students, right? And so
Mm,
this whole apparatus that mobilized against you was designed to mobilize against you and was designed to make an example out of you. And they were hoping for no one to speak up, but when you spoke up, they had a plan in place. I think that's part of the reason
mm,
why the meeting got out early. Their meeting got out early,
mm.
knowing that if your meeting was, uh, it either got out early because everyone agreed and was kowtowed, or it goes late because somebody's arguing, and then they can do to you exactly what they did. And I've seen this over and over and over again on whether it's in private school or public school, the university level, which we'll get into in a little bit. But it's the same mode of operation, and it's all DEI centered. And I don't want to interrupt your story because I want to get to the letter and everything that you wrote when you really came out. But I do want to ask. Well, let me just we'll get to that in a little bit. I want you to go
Okay.
ahead and
Yeah,
finish.
I
Where
mean,
were you
because
going?
this story, it's involved because it has several stages that
Yes,
escalate.
yeah,
So
yeah. So you spoke out in
so
the meeting, and
so I spoke in the
now we're
meeting,
to.
and
Mm-hmm,
I had this happened in February of 2021. The meeting,
mm-hmm.
um, they couldn't even refer to the meeting. They simply called it the events of Wednesday. So it was like a kind of a 9/11, which I found interesting.
Mm-hmm,
But I had 2-hour meetings with my head of school, with the assistant head of school. I had a separate meeting with the head of the whole school, where I was really asked to apologize, asked to recant. Essentially, they said,
mm-hmm,
first they tried to elicit what I felt about what I said, and when it was clear that I had no contrition, and I told them I have no contrition,
mm-hmm,
and they didn't know, they realized that they had to like now put the screws to me. So they
mm-hmm,
went ahead and said, this was the meeting with the head of high school and the assistant head of high school. They just made repeatedly escalating accusations to sort of set the bar where they could actually pursue some action against me, or reason for termination, which was, um, you have made the kids unsafe. You are pedagogically flawed. You took advantage of this opportunity to turn it into your own intellectual circus for your own individual benefit. They said they made ever more outlandish claims. So one of the things that the head of the high school said was, I had caused a neurological disturbance in students' beings and systems, and that I had failed to acknowledge the greater good that which transcended intellectual inquiry. That is the
What
safety.
was there
Yeah.
any data provided to prove that, or
No,
was it
no.
just a
Well,
statement?
no. I mean, it's funny. There was at certain places, these administrators generally will say things like studies show or research shows, right? But we all
Mm-hmm.
know that this research is ideal laundered
Yes.
and
Mm-hmm.
peer reviewed by ideological peers and so on. But essentially, that the basis. I remember him saying something where he said, "We know that asking questions in an atmosphere of anxiety closes the mind." He kept using this thing, but safety and community open the mind.
Mm-hmm.
So this cultishness where you're going to create this
Yeah.
environment where everyone is relaxed and passive and safe, means that
Mm-hmm.
they can impart the higher greater good, right? And
So
so
they
that's the kind of the mentality.
they catastrophize dissent
Yes,
of any
exactly. That's a
form,
great way to put it.
and
Yeah.
they catastrophize dissent, and they over moralize any agreement on the subject for which they've set their premises, right?
Right.
So it becomes this instant dichotomy, this black and white thinking, right?
Yes, and
Yeah.
and yet that's why you'll see in a lot of the uh, this indoctrination sessions, frankly, with the students that they would have is that they would preface them with these meditative exercises called, mindfulness, where they would put you in a passive receptive state. That is, you would have to make these foreground these acknowledgments, preconditioning the event. Things like, I resolve to be open-minded. I resolve to listen. I resolve to these affirmations that are just designed to
Mm-hmm.
lull you into this state of acceptance, right? So they do this,
Mm-hmm.
it's all on purpose. They know what they're
Yeah.
doing. They're trying to minimize dissent. They're trying to minimize obstacles to getting people to adopt this point of view. And that's, anyone who challenges that is like you just walk into a room and take a dump on the floor. That's what I did,
Yeah.
essentially,
Yeah.
to their reality.
Mm-hmm.
And guess what? Other people started to do the same, and that's what they were afraid of, is the influences.
Yes.
So I mean, it escalated from there. But one of the things I did before they reassigned my course, all my classes, they claimed the students didn't feel safe in my classes. Some of them I'm sure didn't. But I had a gag order, so I couldn't talk to any of my students about it. I was, prevented from. And so every discussion of it between me and another student had to be mediated by the Office of Community Engagement, which is, the
Mm-hmm.
institution's arm of people that intermediate themselves into all disputes.
Mm-hmm.
And there's also the Institutional Culture Committee. I mean, this is also Soviet, right? But
Yes.
I wound up recording my conversation with the head of the entire school, George Davison, who had been the head of school for 30 years. And he's an old wasp.
Yeah.
And one of the things he communicated to me in that session was that he agreed with me that there had been demonization, particularly of the white students, who had been accused of things that they were not personally responsible for.
Mm-hmm.
And he had this grand sort of nostrum that we were going to return to this full community, and we were going to read at the end of the year. His plan to fix this demonization of children was to read President Lincoln's last inaugural, where,
Mm-hmm.
with malice towards none. And, I'm like, George, it's too late. That is
Right.
a fantasy. That is a sort of liberal fantasy. I'm like,
Yes.
they have taken over. Like, your beautiful school that's lasted 100 years
Mm-hmm.
has been taken over. And when I said 100 years, lasted 100 years, he corrected me. He said, no, it's over 100 years. And I was like, that's what you're going to
That's what you
insist
got from that?
upon when you
Yeah.
just admitted that the students are, and it doesn't do any favors for the students labeled depressed either, because it just says that, all your problems
Yeah.
are because these white people are keeping you down. So, I mean, the whole thing is ridiculous.
Mm-hmm.
And so I released the tape after he
I remember that.
denied
Yeah.
in my article that he had said the things that I said that he said.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and he had to issue this embarrassing mea culpa. I heard later from people in the school where he fell on his sword, and he's retired.
Yeah.
His retirement was scheduled before this, but I mean,
Right.
he had other problems in that it really was unfair in a way, because I mean, in some ways, he knew there was a problem, but it had totally outpaced his ability to control it.
Yeah.
Right? He was getting drawn and quartered from multiple interest
Mm-hmm.
groups, and someone in that position, it's just the nature of the beast.
Well,
Um,
let's dive into those interest groups a little bit.
mhm,
He's the head of school, and he was put in a position. Obviously, he had a long career. He had been ahead of a very successful school for a while, and up until this point, had a good reputation. What what are the interest groups that you think were putting pressure on him from multiple different levels? Earlier, you had mentioned the universities and what it is they want, and schools like yours, like Grace Church, are very much, they draw students from uh, their ability to get into these schools. So there's that end. But what other what other
You know,
aspects
it's funny.
we're
It's a
putting pressure?
niche. It's like an ecological niche, right? And you as a private school, an elite private school in a sort of hothouse world of elite private schools in Manhattan, and you know, essentially like coastal elite liberal enclaves, is that you are trying to represent yourself as the opposite of what you are.
Mm-hmm.
In order for your marketing, I mean, they don't say private schools anymore. They say
Nope.
independent schools, right? So they
Yep.
don't. Everything they do is designed to conceal the essentially selective nature of these schools and what they truly are. So for that they're they've they've launched themselves, with all momentum towards the DEI thing, in some ways a lot faster than public schools have, because
Mm-hmm.
they have much more of an image problem, an optical
Yes.
problem to solve. So the good thing is that they have been able to raise their endowments and financial aid for people who are, for less resourced groups within the city who
Mm-hmm.
want that opportunity. We brought in, and it's that type of just cultural diversity is not bad for a school, but the way
Mm-hmm.
that they've actually papered over some of the conflicts within the school, which will naturally arise when you have very wealthy kids and some poor kids who are,
Mm-hmm.
I'm this kid is going to go to vacation in the Hamptons, and he's in a class
Right.
and with another kid who's going to go to Harlem for 2 weeks and take care of his aunt
Right.
in a 2-room
Right.
apartment. That's a real divide. Okay, but because in an urban setting there's a racial matrix or
Mm-hmm.
racialized matrix overlaying it, it's a lot easier to talk about race than class. So
Yeah.
they play on the white guilt, and so they squelch the wealthy kids under this sort of white guilt thing, and then they pump up the oppressed kids with the sort of moral authority, and somehow they use a sort of a moral social authority to balance the class issue. This is
So
the tension. This is the lie agreed upon that they've chosen to sort of maintain harmony within this very
yeah,
divergent place.
it seems like they're weaponizing integration, or
Mm,
multicultural or multi-class systems, right? It's like
mhm,
if we were to just allow these students to be students in and of themselves,
mhm,
and let them as students work out some of their differences without a top down kind of, you remember Jonathan Haidt's,
mhm.
Greg Lukianoff's coddling of the American mind.
Yep.
It's almost a free play kind of situation where it's like we don't need to govern their relationships. If you let the kids work
Right.
out their own problems, they largely will.
Right.
Most and a lot better than adults sometimes, right? Because they are in the same kind of environment where it is a little bit more egalitarian than it would be, say, even at a university or definitely in the work world, right?
Mhm,
Um, because you're all in the same class with the same teacher, doing the same homework, doing wearing the same uniform, especially in a school like Grace, and but they seem to take this critical race theory lens, or even now radical gender theory lens, and implant that upon them as an effort to fix the problem. But in doing
mhm,
that, they're weaponizing this integration. Would you agree with that?
mhm. Yeah, yeah, I think that's true. I mean, the part of the reason why they 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 do that is because they're terribly, terribly anxious that the rough patches that will happen if you let the kids sort it out themselves are going to be just optically a disaster for them. Like, when
Mm-hmm.
you let people sort things out, there's going to be some hurt feelings. There's going to be some actual, you know, problems.
Mm-hmm.
But the problems themselves are tied into this national mania that
Mm-hmm.
if you so that's and then the other addition to that is that you have this consultant class which is grifting on that anxiety. So you have these hundreds and hundreds of consultancies and that are coming into these schools and telling the board, you have a racist problem, you have a racism problem, and you need us, the experts, to tell you how to fix it. And let's go on this retreat, to this remote place, and then they indoctrinate the board members. So
Mm-hmm.
George Davison, he was a converted man. I mean, he bought into, every white person is racist, and our privilege blinds us to, you know, But you know what? The funny thing is, he's one of the wealthy. He comes from one of the wealthiest families in.
Mm-hmm.
He's got like the second biggest mansion in the Hamptons or whatever. So
Right.
the fact is that these people who have all this material wealth are actually the most vulnerable to being converted, because their reality, where they didn't let Jews and blacks on them, in the golf
Right.
course until recently, and all the
Mm-hmm.
service people and doormen are black,
Mm-hmm.
they actually don't have the middle class rough and tumble thing. So to them, the woke vision of the world matches their world. So when the
Yes.
people
Well,
talk about, so they fall into the trap, a lot easier than say, I had an upper middle class upbringing. I went to public high school. I was around people of different colors and backgrounds, all
mm-hmm.
and so like I didn't, I don't have this crippling guilt. I did to some degree, but I don't have it to that degree.
Well, it's the easiest. They're weaponizing their empathy, right? Because
Yes, yeah.
the sympathetic feelings are natural and good, right? I mean,
Mm-hmm.
to reach out to, especially when you're talking about Grace School, this is a religious school, with a base that has a Christian morality to it that demands that you look out for, the poor and the downtrodden, and all of that is part of the actual doctrine of Christianity, right? But you you actually enhance that when you have someone who is very well to do and has been well to do their whole lives, but is also taken in the American story of the civil rights movement and saying, okay, well, maybe I can't see what I can't see. I don't know what I don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And these people are telling me what I don't know.
Yeah,
Right.
right.
And just take it all in. And then because these are the people in power, they adopt this and
Mm-hmm.
implant it into their institutions, not knowing that, wait a minute, what you didn't know was that largely people like I think you and I, who grew up in these more integrated societies, didn't have these problems because we actually worked them out
Mm-hmm.
amongst ourselves and with the people that we actually went to school with. And we, sometimes it got rough,
Mm-hmm.
but I want to hit this point of the market forces, because I think you touched on something that's very, very important here, that any business, which if you want to talk private or independent schools, they have competition. And in a capitalist society, we've all agreed that, competition is good. But I think we run into a problem here when the student is the commodity, right? Well, a little bit,
Mm-hmm.
you
Oh
make
yeah,
money
they're
based.
the product. Yeah,
Yeah,
they're the
they're the product. And so therefore, um, if you have these grifter classes that are coming in to imprint this ideology into a new cash cow, what are the dangers to, because you mentioned also how this manifests in students, right? So
mm-hmm.
in that intersection, if you want, if we can use that word, of those two things, the market forces and how it affects the students, where do you think that that's going? First of all, how does it affect the student and in what you saw in the classroom? And how do you think we might be able to mitigate that, especially in the private school setting, given the market forces?
You can't. I mean, there is this is happening on multiple levels, all going the same direction. So the top, what are seen to be the top elite schools in the private sphere, there's 2,000, 2,500 nationally.
Mm-hmm.
They all belong to this same network. This essentially, it's an association. It's called an association, the National Association of Independent Schools. And so the National Association of Independent Schools provides best practices around equity and inclusion and justice, and they host conferences for the administrators and the teachers and the that are run by the consultants. And there's this whole ecosystem where the consultants move in and through these schools at the same time that they're selling them
Mm-hmm.
services. So it really functions like a cartel, in that when you're an NIAS member, the NIAS has plausible deniability about how much power they actually have over you and what they tell you to do.
Mm-hmm.
There are best practices, there are suggestions, there are handbooks, but it also provides cover for the schools themselves, and they can say, well, we're following the best practices of the NIS, and so it is this marriage, extremely convenient marriage, where if a parent complains about something, they can say, well, we're just following the best practices of the NIS, and it provides legal cover and all these other things. But the end, it really is sort of like the institutional capture of all these individual schools, which has become an ideological capture, because everyone coming out of the ed schools and coming through the humanities courses that want to become teachers and administrators are all aligned with what what the previous generation has taught them around woke ideology, because 30, 40 years ago, the academia became a refuge for radicals in the 60s. And so what we're seeing is like the children of the revolution moving through these institutions and carrying the culture with it. And it's really created a massive groupthink around this, where they may pay lip service to diversity of opinion, but there can be no diversity of opinion around what is a moral imperative. And so these are taken as moral imperatives. So there are multiple interlocking forces that are running through these institutions that are still trafficking on their traditional brands, while at the same time, tradition being a dirty word. So it really is interesting.
And I just want to make a point here that this is the NAIS accreditation website. And this is just one point. You said that they have roughly 1,900 to 2,500 schools that they claim as being accreditation, right? As that where they have influence. But I want to show you something here, that approved accreditors for NAIS membership. All of these accreditation institutions are regional, if you look at this. And they range from private to, religious schools like Episcopal organizations. There's ISAS, there's ISACS. Just one of these, I believe it's, I want to find the right one, but there is one of these that claim 5,000 schools just by themselves. And so the web, just like you said, plausible deniability, and this is in states like Texas, it's in states like Colorado, Florida, Oklahoma, all of a lot of red states, not just blue states. But by being accredited by one of these institutions, they are being influenced by NAIS, because NAIS is influencing these institutions. So
they accredit the accreditors, basically.
Exactly.
Yeah. That's their lever.
Right. And this is I just want to make this point, that we all agree that the teachers unions are bad, right? In terms of their influence over public schools and where they push this ideology as well. But these institutions, this is a teachers unions on steroids, because there's no public pushback against a private institution that is actually insulated by several other private institutions. So I just wanted to make that point, that this is,
there is no school board. There's no school board meeting here. You're not going to even get the microphone for 60 seconds or whatever it is.
Right.
In fact, the enrollment contracts at these schools are draconian. If you step out of line, if they even hear you questioning the curriculum in a private chat with somebody, you can be expelled. And it's happened more recently, as myself and other teachers and parents have shined a light on these schools. Their enrollment contracts over the past few years have gotten even more stringent. So, and if you're a student, you have to do what they say. And they don't have the same protections for, First Amendment, any of that stuff, even though some of them do take some government money, especially like since the pandemic. That's a vector that you can maybe attack on that vector, but I haven't seen it done successfully yet.
Yeah.
So you're absolutely right. This is not, this is a market in the barest sense. In other words, you also have to think of the switching costs and the elasticity of this market. This is an extremely inelastic market. The switching costs are tremendous, especially a parent has a child in one of these schools and it starts to go woke,
Mm-hmm.
they have friends. It looks bad in your transcript if you switch schools. You have to have a story. It's like
Yep.
changing. It's harder to change than employment because you want stability for your child. So there are tons of pressures. At the same time, parents who are well resourced, they need a gut check moment where they have to say, "Look, I'm gonna I have the resources to homeschool." There are parents that have successful homeschooling that are middle class, lower middle class, but if you have the resources, you have to take the status hit. With
Mm-hmm.
with with the parents of these elite schools, status is enormous. You have to be able to tell at the cocktail party that you left you left Brearley because you had something better going on. You better have a
Mm-hmm.
better story to tell, and it can't be
Yeah.
I'm going to be a hippie homeschool mom, because that doesn't
Right.
play well.
Well,
So yeah,
the
so
assumption is going to
so
be that there's something wrong with your child.
right, there's something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
until that there is such a reaction that it actually becomes a status below to
Mm-hmm.
maintain kids in these schools, you're not going to see a change. And these schools are going to continue to be hollowed out and traffic in their brands because there are lines out
Mm-hmm.
the door. Like some
Yep.
kind of mass exodus from these elite schools is not going to do a damn thing, because there are plenty of aspirational
Endowments.
parents and endowments. And even if the
Yes.
endowments, even if their annual funds go down, there are people willing to pick up the slack. So
Yep.
that's why my feeling is, when parents ask me, some parents, tortured parents will ask me, what do I do? I feel like, I can work with this administration. The administrations are experts at gaslighting and humoring you if you're a parent, and
Mm-hmm.
telling you that no, this isn't going on, or we're
Right.
making changes. But until you actually see it in the policy, on the website, in the vision statement, in the mission statement, they haven't done jack shit. And
Yes.
you have to accept that. You have to realize that they don't need you.
Right.
They have
They don't.
people waiting to get there. So I mean, I have to have some difficult reality checks with some of these parents,
Mm-hmm.
because that's just
There's
the way it
nothing you
is.
can do. I want to point out this one parallel too. You had mentioned that these are not school boards. You don't have the opportunity to go to a meeting and tell them what to do. You don't have the opportunity to vote them out. Um,
Mhm.
it's very much the university model,
Yep.
where you have a board of regents that may be appointed by the other regents, or in the case of universities, the governor or whatever it may be, the legislature. But once they're there, it's very difficult to hold them accountable for anything, because the only one who can do that oftentimes is the person who put them there, and
Mhm.
then they have direct oversight over the person who actually actively runs the institution. And if they are in full support of that person, there's nothing going to happen. And that's where I think we need to understand that private schools are not this bastion of safety from the woke uh, injection into public schools at times, because you may be able to vote with your feet, but there's an expense to voting with your feet, and if we're going to go that direction, we need to make sure that we look at NAIS and ISAS and all of that situation, because we will end up throwing the baby out with the bathwater in terms of our own abilities to control our education and the education of our children. Because having worked in private schools myself as a director, what Paul just said is absolutely correct. What we are trained to do is listen to you and make you feel better.
Mhm.
We're not trained to let you influence what it is that we do. We're trained to make you think that you are. And 9 times out of 10, parents, I will say this, we are successful in doing that. You come in, and whether it's, you come in because your kid didn't get the part in the play that you thought she should get, or they didn't get the place on the team that you thought they should get, or they're teaching race essentialism in the classroom and collective guilt. It doesn't matter. We will listen and take it all in. We will make you feel like you're the most heard person in the world. And you will walk out of there thinking that you have really made a difference, and nothing has changed. nothing at all.
Hmm.
And just to show you, this is NAIS is. I just want to highlight this diversity and
Hmm.
inclusion page and all of the things that they are working towards in terms of global education and cultural humility. And when they say cultural humility, it is exactly what Paul here is talking about, and what he dealt with. Uh, and this is a mandate. Everyone wants to be accredited by NAIS, the elite schools, because it is the elite accreditation institution. And if they're not, they have to lower their tuitions. They don't get the elite Ivy schools don't get your won't give you preference when considering your students, and that if you don't get your kids into Harvard, then you've now become a second tier,
Hmm.
institution,
Yeah.
and the market has determined that, right? But
Couple of things. Yeah, that I just want to point out on this page. If you scroll down a little bit,
yes, sir.
under featured products, right there, that book,
Mhm.
Hopes and Fears, Working with
Yes,
Today's
let me move
Independent
that
School
over.
Parents. I would say that book is the sort of Rosetta Stone for how administrators talk to parents. So if you're a parent at one of these schools, get that book, because they explicitly say some pretty shocking stuff in there. They say things like, how to work with Black parents, how to work, with Black parents who will never fully trust you. That's a wild assumption.
Yeah.
Well, no one will fully trust anyone. Why would it be, so, it teaches them to sort of market segment you as a parent, and they're going to run a different game on you depending on your race. And one of the
Hmm.
things in there too that's interesting, it says, that there are this group of parents called the 5%ers, and the 5%ers can't be reasoned with. They're totally irrational, and you just have to, completely stonewall them. So all the little tricks in there uh, are very interesting. Also, handbooks about corporate governance. Very often, they're in
Hmm.
violation of their own corporate governance policies, which you can sometimes get them on. And the role of the board is interesting. So there's been in this push, as these schools have become more festooned with woke ideology, the consultants are insistent that the board should stay at a 30,000 foot view, and they shouldn't get involved in the day-to-day operation of the school. And that's a way for them to sort of keep them at arm's length, because a lot of the
Hmm.
board members, if they knew what was going on, they wouldn't be happy about it, even
Yeah.
if they are handpicked by the head of school.
Hmm.
So they there are lots of institutional game. There's lots of institutional game getting run on these places.
Hmm.
Um, so be aware of that. I just want to point that out. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's very good information. I wanna switch gears here a little bit, because it seems that, especially recently, in the last few months, uh, you've had you've had the switch of focus from, not focus, but the movement towards a radical gender ideology. Okay,
Hmm.
and first, I want you to just, do you think that critical race theory and this whole race essentialism and the radical gender movement are connected? And if so, how are they connected?
Yeah, I do, and I think that the thing that binds them is identity. They treat identity in different ways, but essentially they are about um, identity, uh, gender. I think James Lindsay's talked about this. The difference between radical gender theory and critical race theory is that in critical race theory, it's about cleaving to the identity that society's put upon you,
Hmm.
as a power move, as a way to create a block that can act politically. With gender theory, it's kind of the inversion of that, because you're trying to break down the existing boundaries, the
Hmm.
existing categories in society. The irony is that racial categories are actually not based in biology, in the sense that we have ethnic things, and that the gender is. So they are
Yes,
undermining what is fixed and fixing what is not. And
thesis,
so everybody's
antithesis.
going higgledy piggledy to sort of dismantle everything. So
Hmm.
for the child that is a boy,
Hmm.
um, the idea is like, well, are you really a boy? Maybe you feel like a girl, or are you a girl? And because ultimately, there's this sort of protean state of queerness,
Hmm.
and society is putting these labels on you, and maybe you're not comfortable with your label or what you were assigned at birth. So you have to discover yourself. So it plays into the journey of self discovery, which
Yeah.
is part of one's education. And
Hmm.
so it aligns with that very well, and so they're able to do that and create this oppositional way of looking at society and the status quo around the self-interest of your identity and
Right.
what the story that you tell yourself. So they find a different way to create the dialectic, the contradiction,
Well,
between the
and
individual and society.
just want to highlight something there when you talked earlier about norms, right? Norms are the thesis. Queer theory is explicitly, its whole premise is to break down norms,
Hmm.
whether you're talking gender or any aspect of that, your pronouns, all language, but more so than even critical race theory, it is designed to break down norms. So there's your antithesis. And so
Hmm.
you have your norms, your thesis, and your antithesis, your breaking down of the norms in terms of gender and sex and those things. And they're supposed to collide and create what? A Marxist utopia, right? And that is the kind of the essence of
Hmm.
Marxism. But I
The
think you hit
endless
the
queering of society. Yeah, we need to queer
yes,
everything. Yep.
yeah, queer everything. And so we've seen this manifest in many different ways. I think one of the most stark ways that we've seen that is the prevalence or the rise of drag queen story hour,
Hmm.
right? Um, and I've seen you speaking out on this, or even just your changing your pronouns, like we saw with Demi Lovato. I'd seen you posted something on Twitter about that, where she, you know, was a an adult female, a
Hmm.
woman, right, and then became non-binary, changed her pronouns, and now all of a sudden she's feeling female again. So she's
Hmm.
back to she, her pronouns.
Hmm.
So talk to us about that a little bit. What have you seen? Maybe how the drag queen story hour, because that's geared towards young kids, might be influencing society now and in the future, and
Hmm.
what the tools they are using to do that as an example.
Yeah. Well, the drag movement, or the drag mania, that's happening now. You know, it's a vector of attack. It is a mid-level cultural violence on traditional modes, right? So that the idea is to transgress, find the thing which has some cultural legitimacy within a subculture that can be used as a vehicle to, in a sort of Trojan horse way, to undermine the norms, the traditional norms, and create anxiety around people's justifications for those norms. So
Hmm.
the drag queen entering the space with the kids, or taking the kids to Pride, drag your kids to Pride, all these things are is to sort of go beyond shocking the bourgeoisie and really destabilizing the sense of identity that people have that's tied to their actual sex.
Well, and when
And
you say the
yeah,
bourgeoisie, you're meaning the middle class, the majority of America.
the middle
Okay.
class, um, the 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 silent majorities, I suppose. And
Hmm.
what you're seeing now is you're seeing a reaction, a consciousness among this formerly silent majorities that something has been pushed too far. I mean, I can't. I have many Gen X friends of mine who are, I came from a very liberal, progressive town, that are saying, "Yeah, this is fucked up.
Hmm.
I don't want this." And
Hmm.
so they have pushed to the point where they are, their attempts, I believe, have hit a kind of a psychic wall. And it's going to
Yeah.
be interesting because it's like, when it's a very powerful movement. So what happens when a irresistible force meets an immovable object? We're going to find out. Um,
Yeah.
the the thing about drag, which is interesting, is that you see this justification for it as, oh, it's just, let's pretend, it's dress up. Anyone who doesn't like it is
A
homophobic or
bigot.
transphobic. And you see the messaging around it is to minimize the clear sexual provocation of the art form. I think it is an art form, and I do have respect for drag as an adult art form. It has an irony about it. If you read Susan Sontag Camp, there's a lot of interesting things about it. I'm a big fan of the musical Hedwig and the Angry Inch, which draws a lot of drag culture. That musical, by the way, they tried to reconstruct it as this kind of gender anthem, when actually it's an anti-grooming message. The story is about a young gay boy who is groomed by an adult to get a sex change operation, which is botched. So there's a lot there. There's a lot to drag, but where you draw the line is, does it belong in front of kids? Does it belong in church? Clearly, no.
Yeah.
So in order for them to gain access to that, there has to be this message of it's kid stuff, right?
Yeah.
And if you don't like it, you're a bigot.
Yeah.
And it's dress up. But when you actually, what I've tried to do in my writing, the pieces that I've written about it, and recently a drag queen actually came to the school where I used to teach, Grace Church, and danced in the church, this beautiful church, danced down the aisle. The kids were pressured to join in. And this man in a dress is flashing his ass crack in the altar, and that's supposed to be this wonderful inclusive thing. And in fact, like the inclusion of obscenity, the inclusion of blasphemy is the point. The point is to include the blasphemy as a sign of virtue, right? It's almost like costly signaling of an animal, right? We are so virtuous that we can afford to include the ultimate blasphemy and pat ourselves on the back about it. So, but these are kids. Some of them were, there were middle schoolers there, as well as high schoolers. They didn't announce the middle schoolers, but they were there visiting. So, this is an outrage, and we have this conflict now, this cultural conflict around this very extremely self-conscious political decision to introduce this performance to little kids to destabilize their sense of identity as a political project. And what I'm trying to do is say, look, this is not kid stuff. Here's how we know. Look at this person. This is a person held up as a role model. What do kids do? They go on social media. They look at the Instagram. They look at the TikTok. What does this person have on their Instagram? Well, they have stuff about glory holes. They have stuff about fisting. They have stuff about getting turned out, which basically means groomed. They have stuff, one in the pink, two in the stink. I'm actually writing. I'm writing I can't believe I'm writing a piece about private school education, and I'm quoting that phrase. What does that say? But I think a lot of the people don't understand the demi-monde aspect, the sexual provocation of this, the fact that obscenity and filth, and the playing with obscenity and filth is not only part of that world, but also being brought in consciously. I know James Lindsay had reviewed an academic paper, where they talk about, to end filth, or to make filthy. Forget the exact quote. That's one of the important salient parts of drag, to embrace that. If you see, and I remember going to movies like Pink Flamingos, right? If you want to know about drag culture, Pink Flamingos was a huge cult hit, and certainly that's part of it. And I'm not going to say there's no place for that in culture,
right? Well, I want to make that point too. I want to make that point, especially when we're talking about teachers here, because a lot of times it's teachers and administrators bringing this into a school setting in the effort to be inclusive, right? And so inclusion is understanding that when you use the word from the legal standpoint, to include something means to exclude something else. And so what they're saying is that this is moral virtue, and what is the opposite of this is not. So if you speak out against this, then you are the person who needs to be cast out, right? And so it puts you in this dichotomous state. And that's the danger of inclusion. But what teachers do on their own time, right, and they're in the, as long as it's their private lives or whatever that is, that's your deal, right? What you watch, what you who you're with. But it should remain there, right? That's the point. Is that
Hmm.
having gone through education school earlier in the century, it was told, don't bring this stuff into the classroom and that's not just to protect the student. It is at first to protect the student, but it's also to protect the teacher right at that point, because
Hmm.
it can get you in trouble. It can ruin your career. It can do all of those kinds of things. And
Hmm.
so uh, this notion of inclusion has flipped that on its head, almost to where you now see, even in the younger, very young, pre-K, kindergarten, all this stuff being actually injected, which is where Drag Queen Story Hour is geared towards, right? um, Kindergarten, pre-K through third or fourth grade, oftentimes is where it's kind of geared towards. They're trying to I don't want to use the word, but recruit a certain mindset uh, early on, so that when they get older, that's what becomes the moral good, right?
Right.
And
It, yeah, and there's something, actually, I've thought about this, right? Let's say that you were a person who realized that society was, let's say, was restrictive, right? And you were raising your children to be more open to things outside of that, to be like inclusive. And if I was going to steel man inclusion, right, it would be like, you know what, I want my child to be open-minded. And so I'm going to actually kind of, I want to bring in new things, so that so that things that are valued and things that are not currently valued are sort of seen to be equal in a way. Like I want to
hmm
create a wider circle that has everything equal within it.
hmm
But in the process of widening that circle, I have to value the stuff outside more than what's inside. Right?
exactly.
There is no value neutral way to
Right,
do inclusion, because you're
right,
directing the attention and saying this new thing is better than this old thing. And in fact, the old thing, you're a kid, you don't even understand why the old thing is old, because you're
right,
new. So you're actually celebrating the other stuff more than the old stuff.
right.
So it creates a
It's a
hierarchy of value.
discrimination,
It's
right? It's a
discrimination. And
discrimination,
so there is no value neutral way to sort of put your finger on the scale. And I think that it's being sold as, we just want to bring in more things and
right,
everyone's the same. But there's actually, in practice, there's no way to do it, especially
right. And
to
that,
especially to children who are really conscious of what is good and bad, right? Good and
mhm,
bad, good and bad. So
right, good and bad.
and then you'll see the teachers say things. They'll try to, sometimes they'll try to square the circle, and they'll say, well, maybe you're someone who is assigned the same gender at birth that you are, that your genitals are, and that's
Mhm.
okay. But they'll say things like, well, maybe you're not in the gender box, you're outside the gender box. So then it's sort of
Yeah,
like, well, would I rather be free outside the gender box or in my gender
right,
box? Well, I
right.
want to be free, right? So there's always a value judgment. You can't escape the necessity of it.
Well, and that begs the question. All of that begs the question: can we have both? You know what I mean? Can we have it both ways, to where we have a moral society,
Hmm.
or that values the things? We all remember the infamous whiteness infographic that came out of the Smithsonian a few
Hmm.
years ago. By the way, that originated from research done it originated from a former professor at the University of Oklahoma named
Was that
Judith
Tama
Katz.
Okun? Oh,
No,
who?
Judith Katz.
Oh, Judith
Judith
Katz
Katz.
came up with
Yeah,
that.
James and
Good
I
Tama
worked on
Okun.
that together. James and I
Interesting.
worked. I wrote an article. It's on my Substack, but basically, she wrote the precursor in 1978
Hmm.
called
Okay.
to white fragility, called white awareness. I mean, she was
Oh,
one of the
yeah.
first on the scene of critical white
Oh,
studies,
wow. I gotta check
and
that out.
yeah, it's called white awareness. And she left to create an NGO that basically has spread DEI, trainings all over the world. And it was her research that was used to create that infographic. But my point
Hmm.
is that infographic tells us, and going back to the race issue for just a second, I don't want to leave the gender issue, but that when you start demonizing, being on time and the scientific method and linear thinking as whiteness, and whiteness is therefore something to be discriminated against in order to include other forms of knowledge, the epistemological, crucifix here, right? If you want to call it that,
Mhm.
right? It's it's discrimination on the front end, which is against the law, right? Because one, you're doing it to someone's identity and how they may, and you're doing it to a whole mode of life that has actually
Mhm.
proven over time, at least in the last 200 years, 250 years, that will produce greater outcomes for society as a whole, which was kind of the American experiment, right? It's let's throw all these people in here together. We've all got these different values, we've got these different cultures, and the market, the actual free market of ideas at that point, will lead towards an explosion of success in society and a success of human life, longevity, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right?
Mhm.
And so that hits that point. So can we have it both ways then? Can we have, being on time and logical linear thinking, and you can be a girl if your biological sex is a boy, but you can be a girl if you feel like it, and you can change your pronouns if you then feel like a girl again with the Demi Lovato. Can we have it both ways? Can we?
No, it's really, I mean, I think about one of the things I like to say a lot is that we've gone from stereotyping gender to gendering stereotypes.
Oh, that's
So,
good.
we had this restrictive society around gender roles in the 50s and 60s, and right, and the 60s opened that up. And I remember in the 90s of growing up in, wonderful progressive Ithaca, New York, there was this really powerful movement that I think was really helpful, was that if you were a girl, you didn't have to act like a girl. If you were a boy, you didn't have to act like a boy. You could act, you could express yourself as a girl in any one ways, and as a boy the same way. But then at some point it kind of rounded the backside of the moon, and we came back with this thing where if you have this expression, well, maybe that means that you're actually the thing, that the stereotype that you're expressing. And so we're going
Mm-hmm.
to engender the stereotype by, completely transforming to the point of body mutilation your sex. I mean, your actual identity. And so that to me is, the first thing is bad, the second thing is worse. And there were,
Mm-hmm.
we had this sort of sweet spot for a decade or so, and then
Right.
we just fell
Progressivism
off the handle.
progresses.
Yeah, it
Progressivism
has to
progresses.
progress.
It has no stop button. It's built
Mhm,
in. It cannot stop because there's always a new moral good. That's what actually feeds it, right? So it becomes this kind of circular progression in
mhm,
a loop that goes and goes, and you get the sweet spot for a minute where it's
mhm.
vertically aligned, right? I think this, and I maybe I've seen this, and I'm just implanting into my description here before, but whether it's, I think I've seen it in terms of what James talks about and Fury and all of them,
I've seen it's kind
but
of a spiral, like a
yes,
upward spiral.
and
Yeah.
but I'm seeing it kind of horizontal
Yeah.
because progressivism goes right; it goes one direction, and
Mhm.
if you're doing it like this, you get a vertical alignment for a time, but then it hits
Yeah.
again and then moves forward, and then hits again and then moves forward, right? And that's where it becomes destructive, right? Because
Mhm.
you could maybe make the case that okay, drag queens, girls, boys dressing up as girls might be something that adolescents do on their own, and as long as they're doing it on their own and they're not being pushed towards it, and they're just kind of being funny, or what are your Groucho Marx
Mhm.
kind of situation, right? Where it's like you're making fun or just being fun, or even just because you whatever. There's not an adult influence there, right?
Yeah, it's a
Necessarily.
spontaneous, sort of
It's a spotted
organic,
right. It's
carnivalesque, something that emerged is an emergent property of simply having boundaries, to cultural boundaries. I mean, kids
right.
are always testing boundaries, and but there's this moment where it actually becomes it's a deeply conservative thing, actually, to say,
Hmm.
my expression determines my identity, and is therefore
Yeah.
this identity that I must carry with me. I mean,
It's a
it's
Christian
almost
thing.
like, yeah, like
Yeah.
I was thinking today that a lot, like, what's behind the narcissism, in a way. Like, if you look at this as a narcissistic phenomenon, and you can say, well, it's a it's a it's a disease of prosperity and various things. It could be part of that, but I think It's more that we cannot stay in a kind of secular state for long. I think that there's a
Yeah.
kind of a reaction. So you have children growing up with tremendous anxiety because there isn't this moral structure or
Hmm.
collective moral structure. And so like in that there, you if you're going to express yourself, you're trying to yell into a waterfall. You're experiencing so much criticality that
Hmm.
it is a kind of an autism that you are
Yeah.
you are divorced from society and must constantly justify yourself socially. So if you can find a thing like an identity, which is like a sigil, like for
Hmm.
your expression, and you can create this carapace that other people must respect, then that is a vehicle that gives you the confidence to express the thing, because you
Hmm.
know that socially it's lubricated and that people have to accept you because that's my identity. So you have
Yeah.
to, it's like a protein shield for the message that you're sending. And that, I mean, that makes sense to me. That's like, oh yeah, like kids growing up today are under tremendous anxiety around their own worth, and there's tremendous insecurity around that. And so like having this thing, and apparently even Demi Lovato suffers from it. And in fact,
Right.
many people who are traffic in the sort of I want to say the professions of narcissism, actors being one of them. They're the most vulnerable too. So it is interesting. But what I dislike most about making drag queens role models is that they actually teach children that true self-esteem comes from outside validation.
Yes.
That,
Right.
this mutual admiration society where tell me I'm wonderful and tell me I'm beautiful, and if you don't, then you're a hater. And I need this tremendous need, and we need to get back to some interdirected, uh, and maybe there's no way to do that without God. I don't know. Like
Yeah. Well, and it also teaches you that the more noticeable you are, the more important you are to society,
mhm,
because the drag queens will even admit, right, that everything is overblown, right? I
mhm,
mean, they're
mhm.
they're they're kind of they're caricatures, to not use
Exactly.
that word in a pejorative, but
Right.
a of the female form as
Mhm.
taken by a male. That is the definition of drag queens, in terms of just the base way of thinking about it, right?
Right. Right. Right.
And therefore it is a certain art form,
Mhm.
right? And I'm a musician, I'm a classical musician, I'm a conductor. So that's what I'm getting my doctoral work in. And but I want to explore this a little bit because you showed me something that I have yet to see, and so I'm interested to see it. But they're using art as propaganda is something that is happening on a whole scale now, right?
Mhm.
And I think Drag Queen Story Hour is an example of that, because you're taking an art form that's an adult art form, you're moralizing it to the point that you can now bring it into children's um, spaces and normalize that for them, so that as they get older, they will adopt that mindset as it being a moral good, right? That's the
Mhm.
goal. That's what we mean by
Mhm.
the G word, right?
Mhm.
That shall not be spoken, right? Um, that's and it's not necessarily. That's the other point I want to make in terms of that word. We're not necessarily only talking about a sexual form of that word. This is a psychosexual towards a political goal, right? It's you're
Right. And we were
using
talking
sex,
about sexual identities. Well, then that's sex, and you
right?
have a kind of ideological grooming around sex. I mean,
Well,
and
and identity
yeah.
is a misnomer too, because a lot of time it's and you don't even want to use this word because you'll get called a bigot, but it's a manipulation of your preference,
Mhm.
right? And I'm not saying that there aren't people who are born gay. I'm not saying that there are. I mean, I was born straight. I can't. That's what makes me accept that argument that there are people born gay, is because I was born straight and I can't be gay if I want to. But there's also a nature versus nurture when you get kids young, and you can influence a direction, I believe,
Mhm.
to a certain extent. That was the whole mark against conversion therapy, because it's harder to do when you're older. When you're a teenager, when you're more set in those ways, puberty is already hit. But kids are a blank slate. They have nothing. Many of them don't have that sexual urge. And I'm not saying that you can make them gay. I'm not saying you can make someone straight. I'm just saying that you can nudge them. And this is another whole thing that we could get into, but this whole idea of social nudging, which is what is part of this. But I want to hit this artistic point of view, because art as propaganda, we've seen that as long as history, you know what I mean? Whether it's, just want to look at war and some of the stuff that was done on both sides during World War II, that's a great example. Or, in the Civil War, and then before that, art has always been used to bring a message. And you showed me, I'm going to make sure I can share this again.
Yeah, I wonder.
Yeah, go ahead.
People want to see the actual drag queen in the church that lives at TikTok.
Oh yeah. Let's
maybe we show that first, and then that might be.
Yeah.
So let me copy that in there, and then I showed you a video by one of the people involved in the event.
Okay.
Which kind of is, I think, kind of a fascinating thing. But this first thing, it's the latest link in the private chat.
Yeah, let me share it here real quick. So what just go ahead and explain this to us again while I'm getting it up here. What is it we're about to see?
Okay, so what you're about to see is a Pride Chapel. Is it every 2 weeks at Grace Church School they have chapels, and then this is video from a Pride Chapel which they hold in April because the seniors have graduated in June, which is Pride Month, so they do it early. And for this chapel, and they invited a drag queen to come dance on the altar of the church, beautiful church, and talk about their appearance on RuPaul's Drag Race and drag culture, and then do some more dancing, which exhorting the kids to really join in. And her name is So go ahead.
Yeah. This is the video here. Can everybody see, or can you see it, Paul? Okay, just making sure.
Yep.
Just want to get it here.
Her name is Britta Filter, and she is the Queen of New York.
Yeah. That's the musical director.
That's the music director?
Yeah.
So, and you can definitely see more of this person than you would want to in a church setting, for sure.
Her name is
and so there's that aspect of it. There's visible ass crack, but there's also 8 pairs of tights, but it's there. But in a sense, what concerns me more is the elevation of the superficial.
Yes.
Within a context which is supposed to transcend it, right? So this merging of the profane and the sacred, not profane necessarily, in the obscenity sense, but also profane and simply like the parts of the human experience, which are there to like grab your attention in the spectacle of it. So, we can have a whole conversation about that, but
but I want to hit that for just a second, because I grew up in the Word of Faith movement as a Christian, and I think that's something that evangelicals have done to the detriment of society. That everything now has to be in church is not about the introspection and the vertical alignment between heart and God, right? And I'm a Christian, obviously, but it's the extrospection. It's the lights and the sound and the guitar and the drums and the
mega churches. You mean?
Yes. Well, you're talking about your Kenneth Copelands or your Benny Hinn's or your Joel Osteens, and I grew up with my family watching that stuff, and actually we transplanted in our church, and to the point that they would make fun of the mainstream religions who did not act that way and would pejorativize them or demonize them as not being on fire for God or whatever it is, but missing the whole point that it became it was an egotistical pursuit rooted in materialism itself. Right.
Yeah,
and so And what I don't think that people are understanding is that this is a extension of that. You know, all the
Yeah.
evangelicals that are very upset right now about seeing things like this need to understand that some of the ways that you are bracing church's entertainment have led to this kind of perversion of that. It's again that progression. You get a nice alignment for a minute, and then it pops out of the bubble, and moves forward into something you didn't necessarily want. And then we accept it again, and you get an alignment, and it moves out. And so I just wanted to make that point
Yeah,
in terms of the church.
that's an excellent point. And it's funny because I pay close attention to with trolls that come on and post things. And one of the people will say things like, "Oh, what's the big deal about ass crack?" I mean, they see that on the beach, right? So but the mindset really interests me. Like, get into the mindset, because yes,
Yeah.
they see that at the beach. Okay, so like there's a whole question about context, right? Does context matter? And does the sacred and the profane, the existence of the profane, mean that in every context the profane is welcome or should be welcome? Or
Right.
what makes it profane? I mean, and the thing you said about spectacle, you could have the devil's advocate. It's like, well, what is that beautiful cathedral designed to do? It's a spectacle designed, as a bridge to connect the material with the spiritual, right? That's what art is. Art is the material that connects you to the spiritual. It's a bridge. But what happened? I mean, that's a thing like a cathedral. It takes hundreds of years to produce,
Right.
and so the eternal is almost embedded in the art form, whereas something like
Exactly.
this is transitory. And so there's a lot of different ins and outs to that. But someone could say, like, listen, this drag is the way that people connect to the spiritual through the tension, and this is just another form of spectacle. But when someone says just, it's almost that's the tell, is to say that this is this high art thing that you admire is actually this is just another version of this new thing. Right. So you don't get all on your high horse about this high art. And that's really a process that's happened in our culture for
and you're
modernity.
Getting you're getting into where I've done a lot of study here just in terms of my own art form, because you're talking about choral arts, you're talking about classical music, and you know Kant would say there's no disputing taste, right? That's what Immanuel Kant would say. But whether or not that taste has a positive influence on society, is a different question. Right. And when you talk about the cathedrals, right, the cathedrals were built around the people, and they always pointed up. That's the thing, is that, and so when you have a directional spectacle, right, when you talk about the if you saw in that video, the big area at the front was designed to bring the eye there, but it was not around one person. It actually made the person look small.
Yeah,
that's the whole point.
Humility, right?
Right.
And what are we watching? Pride, right? So all of pride is itself the antithesis of what you're talking about.
Right. And so when you talk about high art in terms of religion and those older mainline religions, the art was built to make the person or the individuals pale in comparison to the God that was being worshipped. And it did that from the pew, and even the person being far away, because the person being far away would view the priest in the rostrum area as a small individual, a representative of the voice of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally, really.
Yeah, and
they're watching the smallness of the vessel,
right,
in themselves. They have a connection, but the relative sizing helps communicate it.
Yes, and and I think your point about just is when you're trying to make an apples to apples comparison. If you want to draw a straight line from 1619 to 2019, or you know what I'm saying, you remove all the context, and that's what I've noticed that in my own work. And I don't want to get too deep into this, but when they wanted to rip down the Jefferson Memorial, right, they said that they wanted to do that because Jefferson owned slaves, and Monticello is a fitting memorial, right? So, and because it has the slave housing, but they removed the entire context of when the memorial was built and why it was built. And when it was built was 1943, in the middle of World War II, and it was dedicated in a direct defiance to fascism and racism of the Nazi movement. That's
Mhm.
that's why it was built,
Mhm.
because it was the ideas that built it. And FDR said this in his speech when he dedicated it. He said, "This is bigger than the man whose name is on it. It points upward. The ideas
Mhm.
undergird this. It's the Jefferson Memorial, but only because Jefferson put the ideas on paper." And he said Jefferson is in the foxholes with you. Now, not the body of Jefferson. The body of Jefferson is dead. The man who owned slaves is dead, but his ideas transcend his mortal body
Mhm.
and are with us now fighting this war. And so I think when you talk about this drag queen subset and it being put into a church like that, or what we're about to watch here in a minute, we're pointing everything downward into the individual. And I'm not saying individuality is bad, but when you start to use that to pervert, that's a strong word, but to uh, I'm going to use it to pervert the
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
subset of what an
Deranged, maybe.
individual should
Yeah.
be. Right. Derange
Yeah.
people in their minds at a young age, especially, that becomes a difficult thing.
Mhm. And
So,
yeah, exactly. So this next thing is it's a public YouTube video, music video made by the musical director who um
so this is the musical director we just saw.
yeah, at the front of the altar. Now this is his own project. Um you know, there are colleagues in this video. This is his original music. At a drag queen story hour, he did have several students in elementary school singing this song with in front of other parents. But it you know, talking about vanity, just I want to keep in mind as you watch this what we were discussing around vanity and spectacle and the focus of, you know, the spiritual focus of things.
Hmm.
Anyway, I just
Yeah.
this
So
is
let's
just something I noticed. Someone said this to me today. So
okay. Well, let's see what this is, because I have not seen this yet, and we'll talk about it
all
after we
right.
play.
Love somebody, we need it. Oh, 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 yeah. Love somebody, we need it. Oh, 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 yeah. It's comfortable, it's natural, it's spiritual, it's love. It's comfortable, it's natural, it's spiritual, it's love. The boys and girls like girls, there's room for everyone in between. Holding hands and kissing you, it takes courage like they've never seen. And we don't play by your rules. We just love. I guess we have our own rules. From the stars above, love somebody. We need it.
So there's the school librarian. There's the drama director.
Love somebody.
And now the children.
Yeah, and you know, there was some kids on a bus, school bus. There's a naked man in a bathtub. This goes on and on. Maybe we can post the link, but the thing that strikes me is like the transcendental signifier is love, right? So love is the door,
Right.
okay, and come through the, because everyone needs love. It's natural, it's comfortable. When I watch this, like it feels deeply irresponsible to me.
Yes.
Now this is this is his own thing, it's public, but I actually think the song is catchy. I think
Yeah, the song is catchy.
he's a very talented musician. He's a good singer.
Mm-hmm.
But you know, what is this, and what is
Purpose.
my reaction to this? Feeling like this is inappropriate. Is this legitimate?
Or
I
you're a
don't
bigot.
know. Am I a bigot?
Well,
Am I?
let-
I don't know.
Let me hit this for a second, because
And I think I know.
I think you do too. I think, but it's comfortable, it's natural, it's spiritual, it's love. That's I
Right.
mean, these are the things. Children, music has a profound effect on the soul, but also on the mind. Okay, just to point this out. This is actual my expertise. Don't believe me? Try to say the ABCs without singing them. Right? I mean, literally. And so when you have these kids involved here, right, and you're presenting, if you were to not have the video and just listen to it, the message, okay, minus a couple of parts, wasn't very explicit. It's just comfortable, natural, spiritual love. But then you implant a visual to that, right? Now you have a two-tiered delivery system, right, to impart a two-tiered message, right? Acceptance, love, spiritual comfortability for all people as much as we can. Okay, maybe you can make an argument that that's the moral virtue, right? That is the mott, and then, or and then, or the Bailey, whichever one is which, I can never remember. But then you add the visual to it, the visual art form. Then you see people in nipple tassels and laying on beds half clothed, and then juxtaposed with another image of kids waving pride flags, fully clothed, right? But then another, again, you have another provocative image. That's what we're talking about when you talk about a recruitment effort, or the G word.
Yeah, exactly.
Right?
Yeah, and the there's also, it's self-consciously political. I think there's a line that says, they don't understand. This is something that we're doing, and later in the video, I think one of the lyrics is, until everybody understands, once everyone gets it, we'll all be free. Kind of a liberatory message, which is, these are explicitly political. They fit right in with, the utopian idea of radical gender theory, which has its own kind of eschaton. So yeah, no, I think it's fascinating. And I think, like, these documents that are, this isn't the only teacher. There are lots of teachers that are doing this kind of thing. They do challenge us in a way,
Right.
So I think the more that I can bring it and sort of show it to people and sort of have them, something I hope that he'd be happy with. I'm sure he wants people to watch this. It's on public on YouTube, so maybe.
Well, and here's the other thing that people must understand from an artistic standpoint. If you put art into the world, you as an artist must accept that it's going to be critiqued, whether that's a positive or a negative. If you don't anticipate that, or if you don't want it to be critiqued, don't put it into the world. That's the other part of this. There's not a if I were to sit here and write a song and play it on my guitar and sing it to you and put it out on YouTube, and I leave the comments open on my thing, right? I must be prepared for the responses, right? And when if I were to then take that song and implant visual images of children, you must then be prepared for the critique of how that might affect the kids that you're obviously pointing this towards. And also, let's make the connection between the fact that this is a private video done in his own private musician capacity, but he's also the music director of a church, and we can see the same imagery now being transplanted to the congregation inside the church.
Right. And later in the video, the Reverend appears in this video.
So really?
Yeah. The actual Reverend in, if you can, we can keep watching, or you can scroll.
Well,
I think it's like 2 minutes in, or maybe.
Well, and also there's also, 2 minutes. Let me get
maybe 2 minutes. And I think if you play from here, probably be.
Okay. Let me.
Yeah. I think it's.
I guess we have our own rules.
Well, and even just the use of the flag all the time.
Yeah.
Love somebody. We need it. Oh, yeah. Love somebody. We need it.
Well, and the
BLM on the chest there.
Yes.
It's comfortable. It's natural. It's spiritual. It's love.
Well, and this isn't just geared towards gay people. Obviously, there's scantily clad women as well, right?
There's the Reverend. Yeah. making the sign of the cross with the heart and the flag.
Okay, well,
So you get the picture.
yes, and that's the other part of this, is that it weaponizes the empathy of Christians to give up a lot of the mainline doctrine that undergirds Christianity and has made it last for centuries now. And so that's something that we have to think about.
There's a
Interesting.
campaign. There's a campaign to notify the rector of the church, people who aren't comfortable with what we saw in the church. And I do have a response from him. He says the church supports the school in its efforts to explore inclusion and affirm the value of all people, imperfect though the results of those efforts may sometimes be. If you feel the need to contact the diocese, go for it.
And this is just what is the denomination here?
Episcopal. This is Episcopal.
Yes.
It was mistakenly identified as Catholic because the performer Jesse Havea put down his TikTok, and so there was some confusion. But it is Episcopal. There is a diocese. I don't know much about like the organization of Episcopal churches, but
well, I do. I know a little bit, and there's a lot. I will say this: the way that they intersect with Episcopal schools. Many of the Episcopal schools are taking this in as the doctrine in a Christian standpoint, that the acceptance of all people is the ultimate moral good, you know, and they take the two kind of Christ quotes, you know, love your neighbor as yourself, which is what he said second. He said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, and your spirit. Well, that entails, I don't want to get into a preaching thing, but that entails a whole line of obeying a whole bunch of different things that the Lord said, because that is it. And then, but they take the love your neighbor as yourself. Well, and they kind of even pervert that statement, and they move that towards inclusion, right? We must include everybody. But as we said before, the inclusion of something, it does denote the discrimination of the other, always. That's the legal term in terms of the Supreme Court, even. So it's something we need to think about. Wow, that's kind of shocking.
Yeah.
Well, Paul, I don't know if we should end it right there, but I'll tell you this. I want to say this again, and this is just from me to you personally. When you came out and did what you did publicly, your courage and your strength of standing up in public and saying, this is wrong, this needs to be questioned, and it should be allowed to be questioned, even by a math teacher in a school, or especially by a math teacher in a school, regardless of your race, your color, or your creed, was an inspiration to me, and I know to a lot of teachers out there, when we were all kind of keeping our heads down and running away from this, not even actively, but just by avoiding it at all costs. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
Thanks,
in addition
Mark.
to coming on to the podcast. How can we find you? I want to make sure everybody follows you and where you're writing.
Sure. Yeah, I've wrote a piece about this event in the Post Millennial. I've also have many pieces in Legal Insurrection, legalinsurrection.com. I recently did a piece on the Grading for Equity movement in private schools and public schools. It's really everywhere now. So yeah, please check out my work there, and DMs are open on Twitter. My Twitter's right there, Paul D. Rossi.
And thank God we just got you back on Twitter.
Yeah, that was a whole thing. But I mean, I had a lot of support from my friends and legal help, and I'm really grateful for that.
Yeah.
So it was about 7-8 weeks I was out. Great to be back.
It felt like an eternity.
Thanks. But you know, this is another the purge that's going on right now is a real problem.
Yeah.
And so hopefully, you know, I work
and it's for speaking out against things like this. That's right. And not even this. And I will say this to everybody, that Paul is really tame on Twitter compared to a lot of us, even myself at times, and you know, people that have larger followings. So I think that Twitter coming after him was a testament to the quality of the work he's doing and the points he's making. And
Thank you.
just goes to show that he's somebody worth following and keeping up with. So thank you, Paul, for being here. And we hope to have you on again soon.
Thanks. I'd love to.
All right. Bye.
Thank